Hello, welcome to the fourth in our People Matter webinar programme, organised by Cyber Risk Aware in partnership with the Oxford Cyber Academy. Delighted to see you all here today, and great to see a combination of some regular faces as well as a number of new people who are new to People Matter. Really looking forward to the discussion today with Ceri from NatWest and Richard from the Oxford Cyber Academy, when we'll be talking about the challenges and opportunities for putting people at the very heart of your security education and communications. I can promise another great discussion, no slides, just an informal chat about one of the most critical areas of business risk that any organisation faces, their human cyber risk. The discussion today will last a maximum of an hour. If you have any questions or observations, please do put them in the chat box and we'll try and answer these during the session. Before the intros to Ceri and Richard, just wanted to give you, particularly those who are new to our events, give you a bit of context and the purpose behind the People Matter programme. So Richard and I have worked together in this field for many years now. We've known for all too long that cyber criminals target people before technology. And for just as long, we've been repeating the mantra that a vigilant, cyber risk-aware workforce is our main defence against cyber criminals. Yet, despite all our efforts, we still appear to be struggling to crack the nut, to mitigate the risk. So Rich and I both believe that we need a fresh look. We need new ideas and insight and an evidence base for making our people our strongest link. So that's why we've created the People Matter webinar program. It's designed to bring leaders in business, security and academia together to share their challenges, lessons learned and new perspectives on this challenging subject. What we hope is in some small way we can help to provide guidance, know-how and a trusted network for anyone involved in developing people-centered security cultures and in influencing better security behaviours in their organisation. We can learn from each other, we can learn from others outside security, from academia, and critically I feel from the very people we want to educate. It's our employees themselves that often hold the keys to unlocking so many of the challenges and opportunities we face in security, culture, awareness and human risk management. So just a very quick intro to me. I've been in the security industry since 2000. I worked at a firm called Detica for 11 years, now BA Systems Applied Intelligence, before moving to Axelos Global Best Practice to set up new cyber resilience best practice training back in 2014. I've recently joined the great team at Cyber Risk Aware, where we provide real-time security training and guidance based on actual employee behaviours for organisations in support of their wider business resilience programs. I've worked with and advised many organisations from the boardroom to the security team with HR and L&D teams to help them adopt intelligence and data-led approaches to security education. And I've also worked closely with academia to better understand the behavioural science and the evidence base for what good security education and behaviour change can look like. For me, I think we're still at the start of this journey. The goal is that we all naturally do security as part of our daily lives, whether it's at home, at work, or on the move. The modern workplace is changing fundamentally, driven by what we've all been through over the last 18 months, making it even more important to adapt our security education around the new working environment we find ourselves in. And I think that's what makes today's discussion so pertinent as well. So that's me. Richard, do you want to do a very brief introduction?
Yes, thanks very much, Nick, and hello everybody. Nice to see you here on this fourth of our webinar series. I'm Director of Security Studies at the Oxford Cyber Academy, but before that, a career of rather more than 15 years as a security director, first of all in the financial services sector in Europe, and then more recently in telecoms with Vodafone as Group Corporate Security Director. I don't want to repeat what Nick has very well said, but I think where I'm coming from is the marriage really of a few statistics. The first one is that, of course, cyber attacks continue to increase not quite exponentially, but getting that way, point one. Point two, 85% or so, at least 85% is the figure quoted by Gartner in their latest report on security awareness. 85% of cyber incidents have a human element. Somebody has done something wrong. And yet at the same time, we don't seem to be having any impact on any of these statistics through the security awareness programs that we're going through. So how can we do something about this? How can we really make serious inroads into the statistics and drive them down? So in this series, as Nick has said, we've now had 3 previous webinars with some great contributions from learned and expert people in the field, and that's a perfect intro to Ceri. Ceri, why don't you come in and introduce yourself?
Hi, and like everybody said, welcome to the webinar. Yeah, just to give a short introduction to me. So I've been working at NatWest now for almost a year and a half. Previous to that, I worked at the NCSC for about 8.5 years, where my primary goal was to research socio-technical security. And the element of that I researched was actually people-centered security. So to understand, how do people interact with security and what does it mean to them, and how do we engage differently? And to think about the different elements of that. So to not just think of things that are, say, good and bad, but to learn actually what is going on in an organization, what is the real landscape of that environment, so we can fit security in and make it more fit for purpose. So the thing that led me to doing things in that space was, before working for the NCSC, I did a number of different roles, very much IT related, and starting with doing IT support in a hospital. So I was doing IT support first, second and third line, because it was a small hospital, so you did all of it. So I got to see the way people interacted in their everyday. I got to see the struggles that nurses would have with the security controls, the fact that they would leave their, well, basically a doctor would log in the day and leave it open so everybody could have access, because to log in and out all of the time to authenticate yourself is actually quite a cumbersome timed process that they don't have time for. So what do you do about it? So I saw that firsthand, and it gave me a definite appreciation for the fact that we assume, and we still make this assumption, that people want to use computers, that it's there and there every day, so they want to use them. But in actual fact, it's still, for a lot of people in today's world, in the workforce, computers have been kind of like thrust upon them in a way where they've never truly been explained. They've just suddenly appeared in people's environments and then told that they have to use them. But have we really ever understood what people want out of the computer? Are we really setting them up to fail because systems are built on systems, so it just becomes more technology instead of making it more usable technology? And so that's always been something that's been in the back of my mind. And oddly enough, doing then IT support, and then I used to do web design, and all of these things linked together and then led me into doing a master's in information security and privacy. But all of these things linking together then eventually to lead to the work in the NCSC, where I got to get a handle on actually what research is getting done out there, and then thinking about what does that mean and how to pull that through into the real world, which is what I've been doing then in NatWest.
Thank you, Ceri. That's great. Fascinating background. You've obviously been at to have that time at the front line. That's obviously has sort of influenced your direction of travel ever since. You talked about research, and I know you're passionate, based on our previous discussions, about applying academic rigor in security awareness. Why do you think that's so important?
So for me, there's a lot of work in academia that gives a really interesting direction. And so that comes from not just research within, say, the security field, but elsewhere. So there's lots of things around things like positive security and what does that mean? But a lot of that learning comes from other places and then used in the context of security to see if it's fit for purpose. So research for me is about that discovery, because we know, and as you've mentioned already, we kind of not moving forward in many respects, or there's something else that needs to happen. And so research allows for more discovery, more innovative thinking to kind of look at that problem from a different direction. Because people in workplaces are often taken with a lot of, well, we must do this because, say, a regulator says so, and there's a lot of predetermined ways of doing things already. And research has a space that allows us to see what else is possible. It won't give you an answer. It probably creates more questions, but it's about thinking differently in this area. And so the thing that research brings is, because academics are academics, they bring the rigor to the way that they think. And then it's about how do you use that information well and translate it into something that could be used across an organization, which is often where people struggle, because academic papers are not written for everyday use. And then most people don't have the time, or they're not even allowed the time to look up or find, because it can be quite hard to find, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So I'm really passionate because like I said, I've had the pleasure of being involved in it. I've been involved in research and seen it from the ground up, taken part in research projects, and really believe in the fact that there is a lot of learning that not is being missed, but is hard to find, is hard to translate. And so I want to do my best to try and bring that into things like awareness, to try and change the angle of which people are thinking, to try and see the problem from a different direction, so we can try to move forward, instead of just thinking people aren't doing what we want and just hitting our head against walls. There are different things going on, and how do we continue to learn, and how do we continue to better ourselves? And a lot of that can be found in research, but that does take some work to be able to do.
Can I jump in just for a second there, Nick? Because I'm, as you would expect, coming from Oxford Cyber Academy, a huge fan of having academics involved in this sort of thing, and trying to do it, in fact, in my time as a security director, not so much in security awareness, but more in fraud, different subject. Of course, you're going to have two sorts of research, as you've implied really there. You're going to have the pure theoretical research and also applied research. And in later webinars, actually, we're going to be exploring with some of the academics who do this, the applied research they're doing. I think the key concept for me in all of this, which we need to get into perhaps a little bit, is that their research is evidence-based.
Yeah.
And when you're a security director or running security awareness in an individual company, of course, you will know your reality, but you may well lack the skill to carry out academic research in the appropriate and rigorous way. And you're almost certainly not going to have that broader view, which the evidence-based approach across an industry or a sector is going to give you. So for me, absolutely fundamental, evidence-based in everything we're looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I find really fascinating is, so lots of people will write about the way that they will find out things, and a lot of it comes down to like cultural surveys, for example. But the way that you write a survey and the way you ask questions is really, really important. And most people have never learned how to do research, or the basics of actually the way that you ask that question has really biased the answer. So of course you're going to come out with that. I mean, have you really learned anything? What do you hope to get from that? And so there's this area that I think people just not forget about, it just don't see because it's not visible to them. But the way you ask questions, the way that you state things towards people, the language in which you use is really, really important, because if you write in a particular way, you will always bias your results, which will mean whatever you then go on to do will be not from the best position, because you've predetermined everything beforehand.
The science of good research is a science in itself, isn't it? I remember doing research with Ipsos Mori a few years ago and being taught a lot of very valuable lessons about, I gave them, these are the questions I want to ask, and they said, you don't ask those questions. But anyway, before sort of delving a little bit deeper into how you apply this, this evidence base, Ceri, have you got an example? Can you pick out an example of something where you've seen in practice some research that's been, driven out of academia, applied research that's now you've seen actively being used and engaged within organisations around security awareness?
Yeah, so one of the main areas I would say is, so the research I've been part of for, like I said, for about 10 years has always been around the idea of positive security, and how do you engage people positively instead of using the negative, which is often what you find in security? And how do you look for the opportunities for changing people's environment instead of just believing that they themselves have to change? And one of the elements of that is, especially in awareness, is bringing that idea to people across security. Basically, it's not to, of course, the people in the organization get the benefit of it, but first of all, it's about changing the mindsets then of people within the security field itself, and within the teams themselves, to see that you don't have to say security in this way. You don't need to view it in this way all of the time. And in actual fact, by just tweaking the different wording, the different angles of your messaging, it really can re-engage, or it can better inform people, because then they want to read it. They don't feel slightly undermined or blamed or told that they're a risk. They're actually thinking, this is information for me, this is something I can do, and this is something that I feel confident in then being able to do, which is really important. And the biggest piece of work that I've done that on really is through the NCSC. So I was a technical lead for the cyberware program that they have. And one of the changes for that is not to change all of the messaging. I mean, security messaging doesn't change massively. It's always going to be roughly the same sort of thing. But what can we do to slightly change the way it's said so people can see it differently? Because a lot of people believe they know this stuff already, that they felt that they've learned it already, so they're not paying attention. But if we tweak the wording, we tweak the way that it sounds to make it more action-based, so it sounds like something they can do, and then support them with showing them how, by giving them very obvious links to things or pieces of information to follow, then to break it down in that way instead. And that positive framing, that breaking things down, comes from, like I said, the research we've done for a number of years. But it also comes from places like, because I had, like I said, the pleasure of being in government where you get access to lots of different information. People like GDS who talk about content design and the way in which you design the content around what you want to tell people. And then also people like the behavioural insights team around nudging, and bringing those sort of elements together as a whole to think about, actually, these pieces are distinctly different, but there are elements of each of them that can be used to improve more positively the way in which people interact.
And in themselves, as one-off, there is no silver bullet, is there? It's a whole combination of different approaches, but if it's all underpinned by this positive message, you've got a far better chance of success.
Yeah, no, absolutely. One of the things I think people really underestimate is that because security messaging has been around for so long, and it is somewhat negative, no matter what people say, people have this, honestly, the amount of people I will tell what I do as a job, and their initial reaction is either not to be interested or to say, I'm not technical, so I have no idea about that, and it's not for me, is a really high percentage. And there is a reason for that, because it's been told in a particular way, either within their organizations or more broadly, that it isn't for them, because we use things like really technical language that is full of jargon, which is hard to grasp. I give talks, for example, that say to people that I actually don't care about the technical language that is used. If somebody wants to call two-factor authentication JIM, but people understand what JIM is and they do it, it doesn't really matter the technicality of what it's called. And really challenging that sort of logic, because yeah, all you're trying to do really, and what you're trying to get, the nub of the issue is to get people to understand enough so they can perform the action, and that they feel confident to be able to perform the action, so then they actually do it. Because even if they recognize it and think that they would do it, that's not a given. Like, I know a lot of security stuff, doesn't mean I do all of it all of the time. So you have to allow people to feel confident to pick and choose as well at those times. And it's that building that confidence and that capability in people that's really important. And if you're constantly telling people that there's always a threats are evolving, they're vulnerable, they're a victim, that doesn't allow them to frame themselves in a way that then they feel able to cope. You often put them between a rock and a hard place where they actually don't know where to go. And then they often are lacking the support, because we don't follow up with, what does that read? How do you cope with that in the back end? So people have often felt a bit adrift with that sort of information.
Just going back very briefly on something you said just now, Ceri, about changing the mindset within the security teams themselves. I was talking to a lady that runs security awareness and culture for a large organisation within the critical national infrastructure a couple of weeks ago. She's new in post, and one of the things that she wanted to do was to go out and ask and talk to colleagues, employees, what's your perception of security? When was the last time you met someone from security? That she's been met with who are they? Never met them before. What's this policy? And what we would expect, sadly, is that there is this often a chasm between the security team and the rest of the employee base within the workforce, and the security teams who are responsible for writing and controlling and managing the security controls. Often there is that mismatch between what, as you say, what they know is right and the way in which that's communicated in an effective way to get people to do what they want them to do. Mm-hmm. So I think that is an ongoing challenge. But
can I just pick that up, Nick, because I think both of you are absolutely right on that. In fact, I always tried to make it a priority when I was a security director, as it were, to get security out of the closet. There is a tendency for security as a function to be very introverted, and even very basic things like getting people at the head of the security team to understand the business objectives of the business. I mean, it seems such a fundamentally obvious thing, but it very often isn't. So start out by looking at your security team and getting it to open itself up. This links into something that Ceri was saying that reminded me of our talk last time with Sean John about digital empathy, and actually not trying to do security to people, but actually understand what people need, what they expect in the way that they're working, and then gradually infiltrate, as it were, security processes into that. So don't work against the grain when you're in security, but understand what the grain is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's something that I always say to my team is, I'm not here to tell people realistically what good and bad is, because that is very variable, because the organization isn't one entity in itself either. An organization flexes massively and will be very agile to changes in its own environment as well as externally. So for security to believe and use language that is, say, to good or bad, really confuses a lot of people, because their context is really, really important, and you have to be able to bring yourself to them in a way that is open, that you're ready to listen, and that you can hear what they're actually trying to say, to make sure that security can be fit for purpose. So you're trying to create a balance instead of trying to just tell people what right and wrong is. And how you create that balance is all about understanding and wanting to understand, and then practicing, because it's not a given that people are capable of doing it, of being able to approach people in that manner. And there's pieces of research that I've done called Security Dialogues, which works to trying to build dialogue between people instead of trying to basically just tell people what to do. It's actually to come together to bring coherence and concordance to people. So it's more of a together collaboration, and people can see that even though you may have to do the things that you may not like to, at least there's a better base for understanding, instead of it seem to be coming from randomly from left of centre for no apparent reason, suddenly that they have to do something that will interrupt them. But if it's always going to be interrupting them, they're never experiencing something positive in that workflow, something that's likely to interrupt them and get in their way. And of course, then that knock-on effect to their experience of what they tell other people, what they do next time they do a project, maybe even years later, people remember that feeling, and so they build up this real reluctance. And that reluctance, I think, because security's been around for so long, I think a lot is around that reluctance now, because it hasn't gone well before. And so they're unsure, and that being unsure and uncertain makes people feel fearful of engaging and taking part, for sure.
So we've just had a question from Chris. Thank you, Chris. So it's a challenge. So quotes from a member of his staff: "If I click on something and it does something malicious, it's not my fault. The company should have stopped ever getting to me. This is a person with 40 years plus service and is very tech savvy. How do you change this mindset?"
So that's it. Yeah. So that's an interesting question. So that's about that balance. So it all depends on your culture and your organization, I would say. If you treat people in a way that is very parent and child, and you take away their autonomy to anything, and you don't allow them any control or perhaps that trust, then I think that's a perfectly legitimate thing to say, because you've created that scenario to be said. But what do you do about that? That's really, really difficult, because that's very embedded. That natural reaction of people where they say things like that is very, very telling. And this is why I say, like, coming from things from a slightly different direction and a slightly different position means that it can be you have to hear these really hard things and not just think what he's saying is wrong. Well, actually, given the environment he may be in, I don't know the workplace, but given the environment he may be in, the experiences perhaps of other people, actually that could be a really legitimate thing. So how do I see that in the way that it perhaps is being said, which is, we have a problem probably elsewhere. It's not so much about that. It's probably what is the subtlety that is being given, or the undercurrent of the messaging that perhaps is already there, that already is set. And how do we change that? So, like I said, we move to this dialogue-based approach where it's more about collaboration and bringing people along with you instead of seeing things as right or wrong, because that's a really, really hard place, because then you end up with really extreme reactions like this, which is just like, well, it's not my fault because everything should be done for me because I sit within this organization. And part of that comes down to as well that that transparency of which security has or doesn't have. Being honest, like, there's only so much we can do as well. Like, we do need the support back, and we will support you. And having that, like I said, openness as well through that dialogue is part of that.
It's a good cue to sort of my next question, Ceri, which is what lessons have you learned in building communications and training programs for what I suspect are widely diverse audiences, whether that is by age or country, function, their own perceptions and attitudes? What are the key lessons you've learned?
So one of the main things is people never read things as you expect, ever. They will probably skim read something, or even if they read it in its entirety, they never really quite see what you have read, what you have written, or what you believe. So the thing that I would say is definitely test your messaging with people who are outside of security. And I mean, not even your friends, because they're going to give you a relatively positive piece back. It's to just double check yourself, like, how would this land? Does this make sense? So I do that a lot myself, because just again through practice, doing work with academia and so forth, I can do that as a starting point. But again, that does take a little bit of time to be able to sit back, reflect, and accept that in actual fact, I don't know what is the best thing all of the time. I can set the tone and then see what happens. And then if it's not working, I'll change it. I'm not going to build it up to be the only way to accept that it has to say this. If somebody doesn't know or doesn't understand, then okay, let's change. It's fine. I mean, I'm not the arbiter of truth in this matter. So how do we build that in? And it's something, like I said, especially when we're doing the cyber aware work in the NCSC, that was really, really important. In actual fact, I always say to people, it seems like those messages are really straightforward and actually simple. But those messages went through a 1.5 years of testing and getting feedback and understanding how people perceived them and what they would say about them and so forth and so on. And even though I've left, I know that continues to double check our own perception of how other people perceive these messages. And it's that double checking that's important. And it did mean that even though I understand a lot of this stuff, it doesn't mean I'm perfect. It meant that people would still come back and say, it still sounds too technical. And you're thinking, wow, people really aren't at a level that you expect them to be at. How do we deal with that? And like I said, it's just a lot of like double checking yourself. But the main thing for me is always, we aren't trying to turn people into security experts. They do not need to read a tome of a document to then figure out at the end what their action is to try and say what you want really concisely as an introductory, probably only a few lines. Tell them what you need to tell them, maybe only 1 or 2 things because you don't want to overload them. and then sign off in a really kind of positive way about, and I know it sounds really cliche to say, but it does work, is about engaging them in the fact that they are helping you and you are helping them type of language. And it, like I said, starts to build that relationship of honesty and transparency with people. And I've done that when I first entered the bank, and I actually had the compliment that that's the best email about passwords I have read in 40 years. Who says that about passwords? And it was literally just to take out as much of the content as possible, to make it really concise, to make it really straightforward and obvious to people what it is we were trying to say, instead of all of this other things that security often tries to give is extra detail. People aren't interested in the extra detail. They just want to know what it means in an introduction, what to do, and any follow-up and support that they may need afterwards.
Can I just dive in there? Having worked in the financial sector for a number of years, heavily regulated industry, masses of stuff to read. And
Yes.
if on top of that, as you say, you've got a tone from security. First of all, nobody reads any policy in my experience. They might read the first 2 lines. So the presentation, the language used, as you said exactly, Ceri, is really, really important. And then we can get into a side conversation perhaps about storytelling is a better way of doing this in the first place anyway, or finding other methods of doing it.
Yeah, and no, absolutely. And so I said to the people, like, I get asked questions about like how to introduce the topics, like in emails and so forth and what have you. So one of the ways is if you've emailed them previously and they've tried, or perhaps they still haven't done something, is you don't know if they have actually tried or not. So you can still thank them and be pleasant to start with. It's not to then say that everybody is bad because something isn't working. It's to approach them pleasantly, relatively, and loads of people think that that's too soft or this and that, and it's got nothing to do with that. It's about treating people like human beings. They're adults who have come to work to do a job, who come to work for not to do security most of the time. They're trying to be as productive as they can and probably being judged in their own work environment about how quickly they do a task, how efficiently they do a task. And so their productivity is really important to them. So why aggravate that? You want to fit in to make sure that what you're saying can be taken on board in that moment. So be pleasant about it, be welcoming to them, try that sort of way. But what often happens is that security messaging can do that, but then at the end it will say, but if you don't comply and you're not doing this, then you're going to have something taken off you as a threat, which undermines then the rest of what they have just said. It has to be, you can use threat and fear, yes, but it has to be done very, very cautiously and at the right times, at the right moment. And you can't just think that putting that line in there takes away all of your responsibility of that support to that person, because you've told them that they need to do it, because you've threatened them at the end, so they should. And that's a really hard balance for a lot of people.
And for me, Ceri, coming back to the evidence base, what's the evidence base for something like this sort of consequence model actually works? I don't believe there's any evidence base.
No, there is research that proves, so fear can work, but it is very heavily caveated in how you do it, when, where, in the way that you do it, and how often you do it, and all of those sort of things is actually really, it can work really detrimentally, and to the point where most people, and there's a lot of research that shows in security and outside of security, that if you use that heavy-handedness too much, and if you use that consequence model too much, what you do is you just disengage people completely, where they don't take part at all. So they don't even try. They see it, and for whatever reason, they may be fearful, or they may just be fed up of it, or they have some sort of fatigue to it.
Well, it certainly shouldn't be the default model. I mean, what possible level of trust are you building with your workforce if you're all the time sitting on their necks and threatening them?
Yeah, exactly.
To me, it's just counterintuitive.
Yeah, but it is something that I don't know, there's a thing in security that it should look and feel a particular way. And that doesn't always come from the security professionals themselves either, or awareness people. There's this predetermined view elsewhere. And I find it so when we, and I had it in the NTC, and it's the same in the bank, when you're dealing with people like in comms, because it's security, there's this level of seriousness or expectation of wording and sounding that it has to have to be about security. Like, it has to contain these sort of things. So I spend a lot of my time speaking with comms especially, to try and break that down a bit more, to give a different viewpoint. And once you say that to a comms team, they love the fact that you're changing and they don't need to say it in that way. They're perfectly open to it. But it can be a blocker to a lot of people, because not only do they feel that it needs to in one level in their job, then the security professionals outside of that have this expectation as well sometimes. Then they go to a comms team that then layer that expectation back down on them. So of course that's what then gets done, and to push against that can be really difficult. So that idea of consequence has been around for a long time, and that's what people feel. If I do something wrong, something's going to happen, it's going to be bad for me, it's going to get reported on some file of mine, or it's going to be mentioned to a manager who would then have a conversation with me. That manager will probably then be judged against it. So his conversation with his member of staff or her member of staff might not go so well, and you can't control that then. And that also affects the way that people view security. And like I said, what we forget a lot, and it's not something that you find in research, because research is often over a smaller time scale, is that longevity effect. So what is the effect over time of this sort of viewpoint that people have, and how do you actually get to influence their worldview? Because they have already created a coping strategy around security. They already have a way of being around the way in which they cope with security and fit it into their everyday and know which bits to tweak or not. They will comply in particular ways and so forth. So how do you influence something that already exists? But what we do in security is we often believe we're giving people new information all the time, which isn't landing with people's. But we have to remember they already have a world and they've already created that world. So how do you influence into it instead of expecting them to open up to you?
Yeah, so what are the sort of the key lessons that you've learned then, Ceri, leading on from that, in building that sort of emotional engagement, you know, that appreciates sort of the environments and the day-to-day issues and challenges people have in their day-to-day jobs, let alone being compliant with security, again, across a diverse workforce? And so, have you got any sort of practical takeaways that people on the webinar today can use?
Yeah, so my first thing, and I say this to other, especially security awareness people, but it's generally applicable to anybody in security, is often when you're looking at breaking down a problem, what most people will do is believe their starting point is that policy is correct. Well, that's not true. I just want to say that now. Let's break that assumption and let's look at actually what is it that we're trying to solve? What is it that we're trying to do? And what is the purpose of that? And who is it going to help? Because what we often do is we jump to solutionizing a problem, which builds in a lot of assumption at the beginning that their starting point around policy is the correct starting point. And then we build up from there. But if your policy isn't working, or as been mentioned, that people aren't reading it, then everything that you build afterwards is also going to have some flaw in it. So let's stop for a moment and reflect, actually, what is it that's happening? And so we wrote a piece when I was in the NTSC that's based off the work by Lizzie Coles-Kemp and Angela Sasser called U-Shaped Security, which kind of starts addressing these issues, is to understand that landscape of your organization, to, like I said, stop for a moment, reflect, look at what already exists. So we already have lots of already existing information across your organization, and take note of that and see what is really happening on the ground. Because if we're not doing that, like I said, we just build these preconceived ideas, which is really difficult, and you need to be quite challenging to go against that. Don't get me wrong, it's not straightforward to do, but part of that fundamentally for me is, for generally and in security, is about that trust, that transparency and that honesty, that actually we can see that this isn't working, that we can do something differently, and it's okay to do something different. It might mean that I can't create straightforward metrics, but what I can do is give you a deeper understanding of what could be the next steps. But that isn't straightforward to do, and I will need time. And that's the thing, same with research, is that it's not a straightforward answer. This isn't about just bringing in a consultant who can create a graph or what have you that may do some of that. It's about actually thinking more deeply, because this space hasn't really moved forward, as you mentioned, and there are lots of sticking points. There's something else, right? There has to be something else that we can do. We can't just keep going around the same circles. So we need to go further back. We need to start looking deeper into these things, because if we're not, then we're just going to go around the same loops over and over again and hope for the best. But we know what already happens because we've already been doing that. We still look towards people as if they're somehow the masters of their own destiny in an organization, and as if they can change everything within their own will. But in actual fact, they can't. They're just people. They sit within an existing system that sits within probably 12 other existing systems. So their influence and their ability to change is minimal. And it's actually really hard for them because of so many other demands that are going on.
And then
just make sorry, Nick, just to interrupt, just to make a comment about understanding what's going on in the business. One technique that I've always found very successful is a system of so-called security ambassadors through the business. So people who are colleagues in other different departments, not security professionals at all, they're given a sort of minimum amount of sensitizing training about what security is and what it tries to do. And then they act as a kind of two-way sensor in their own department. So you get a constant feedback of messages to the security department and then from the security department as well, not least, as you say, is seeing how they're landing. Is that something you've tried and that has or hasn't worked for you?
So I haven't tried it myself. In the bank, we do have people that spread the messaging, but across the board, especially in research, it's very variable because it depends on who those people are and the support that they need. So I know that they can initially work. But for me, again, as I said, it's that long-term effect of then being that single point and the support that you give to that individual, that ally, the champion, or then whatever name that people use, is that I have seen a lot of research that shows that can become a very lonely position because everybody moans to them about security and then they feel very got at. So it is something that is an interesting concept. I think does need to be done on a wider scale for longer, but finding programs that work long term, that because people leave as well, like in security, they leave and so forth. But getting that over time is actually quite difficult, I think. But yes, it is an element that can be used and should be utilized. Is that how do you learn, especially like with a bank because it's so large, that scale size is how do you get that feedback back is important.
So it leads on to another question, but we've got a comment here from Adrian, a question from Adrian. What are the emerging or existing tools and technologies that can help scale this alternative approach to messaging? Are things like gamification and immersive learning platforms making a difference, or is there something else that research is showing is more effective?
So I think a lot of the research at the moment shows it's focused around gamification. I think that's still there's still an interesting piece around that of how much of an impact that really has. And again, over time, so it will always initially have an impact, but it's that ongoing impact to actually change the mindset and change that worldview of influence. And because, like I said, that is actually quite hard to grasp, but a lot of research is focused on the idea of gamification. Immersion definitely is something because there's a lot of like tabletop exercises and immersion through different ways. And the idea of using things like storytelling through those methods definitely brings people a lot more with you and allows people a different sort of language because they're able to connect better and then they're able to articulate themselves probably a bit better through that process. And so there is research around that, but less so in security, I would say. That's elsewhere around organizational culture and so forth, and resilience, for example, where those things are used more heavily, and there's more research around it in that space. Yeah,
and for me, I was asked in a webinar a few months ago, is gamification the answer? And I said, well, it's part of a much bigger sort of solution. But for me, what sits behind gamification is that power of stories and stories told well. You can tell stories very badly, as we know. So it's important that they're told well. That also leads on to something that Chris that asked the earlier question. He said, one thing I always try and communicate is this should help in your personal lives, not just work. So they and the company winners have taken on board. How many people are willing to share personal information, e.g. on Facebook, about their mother's maiden name, first card, place of birth, number one record when you were born, etc. So there's all this outside, and obviously we've seen that over the last 18 months with the hybrid working and home working, the much wider sort of issues and challenges and frustrations we've had in working from home as well.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was going to say, actually, one of the hardest things for people in that space, which I definitely think there's room to help with, is because work will give some messaging, and then there's an outside world that gives different messaging. That consistency is really hard to break down to people, because at what time do they believe what thing, and making sure that, yeah, exactly. And so making sure that your messaging is consistent and can spread over both things, and what have you, I do think is really important, because without that, what they're looking for is random things online which will possibly contradict what you're telling them in work. And then who do they believe? Where do they go? Well, this person over there told me this, but you're telling me this. And again, this is where they create their own world. They then bring those two things together and create their coping strategy, because which one is it? Because they sound somewhat similar, but not exactly the same, which is kind of okay. But actually, that's quite a lot of mental effort for a lot of people, because they struggle, because they don't know this space of which route to go down. And again, this is one of the things when appreciating this space, is that understanding that, again, people aren't empty vessels. They already come with pre-existing knowledge, experience, and assumption about what they already know. So how do you affect that and change that is important, for sure.
Again, just make a comment on that, because I think a theme that's come through several of our webinars has been that actually, and Nick is right, there's no silver bullet. You need a range of techniques and options and processes, some of which require more than security skills. In other words, this isn't something which just the security department can be doing. It actually needs help. Well, of course, you could look outside, but within your own company, if you're any size, there'll be people, particularly in HR and marketing and in communications, who will have some of the skills and techniques that we lack, and we can work together with them to get the messaging right, for example. And we found in one extreme case that actually it was the marketing department that was best at getting our message across.
Yeah, and it's something I will say that I've started to say to people is that, and it's something I notice in research still to a degree, is that the assumption is that security professionals, again, are masters of their own destiny, but in actual fact, their actual power and their ability to change things can be very limited depending on the organization they're in, because there's compliance, there's regulation, there's this, that, what have you. So there's a lot that sits on top of them as well. I mean, they can't change everything, yet we make out in the way that we talk about security professionals, we talk about anybody in security, as if they are the ones that can change things, as if they are able. But in actual fact, I think that is relatively unfair. It is really hard, because again, there's this pre-existing idea of what security should be. There's a lot of layers and that sit on top of them. So how do they find their route through? That takes a lot of time, thought, a lot of collaboration with other people. But is that always valued? Well, no, because they're not looking at a screen that's pinging something that they can do something about that creates a metric. So actually, that's not the thing that people then get the credit for. They're often not seen for doing that sort of work, even though that is vital in what they're actually trying to achieve.
And I think something we've discussed in the past, Ceri, as well. I think that this whole area of awareness education, traditionally, it's been driven by metrics that are potentially very wrong, i.e., how many people have taken security awareness training, how many people have opened up an attachment on a phishing simulation. Ultimately, it means nothing. It means absolutely nothing. It's not assessing and tackling and identifying behaviour change over a period of time.
No, and it is something that I find it really interesting, this idea that this metric tells you something, but what it tells you, the metric, but what do you do after that, and how does it affect your organization? And don't get me wrong, some people will use it to a degree that really makes change. I think that's a lot more rare than we actually realize, that these statistics they look nice, and don't get me wrong, I can get very taken with looking at them, but what is behind that? What is it really telling me? And does it change that much? Because, yeah, I know that everybody will click on an email at some point in their lives. I know that already. So what else is there? So you need to look towards other things, like, say, for example, the types of emails they click on, the way, the time of day they may be clicking, or other things that exist to help you not to then do anything or tell them because they're clicking that they're bad. It's to just allow you to slightly change maybe the comms that you're doing, change the training that you are, tell the rest of the security team these factors are important, and how to consider that then across a wider piece, instead of just focusing in on that one element.
Very good. We're getting close to the end, Ceri. Just one final question from me. Where do you see innovation in security awareness over the next 2 to 3 years? What do you think it will look like? What directions are we going to go in, do you think? Or should we be going in?
So for me, there is lots of innovation in the space in the way that people see it, and there are lots of really interesting people doing work that is often unseen, and you do kind of have to be in the right circles to know about it. And part of that is down to understanding different sorts of engagement and what can be done with that. So, for example, both of you have mentioned storytelling, but actually that's very rarely done, and that's very difficult to do well, because telling a story is a skill that isn't given, most security professionals don't have, because it's something that is taught and you should learn about it before doing it. And those different layers. So we talk a lot about personalization, but that might overstress people in certain situations. We don't know yet. So there's a lot of still testing around this sort of space of what works. And I don't think there's a silver bullet to that. I think there's different ways of which that can be done. But one of the things I think is really important is, for me, is the recognition of security fatigue around the issues of the messaging sounding the same tropes that are being said, like don't click on links. Like, why do people say that? It's not a thing. Everybody clicks on links because that's how the internet works. You have to. Otherwise, you couldn't get anywhere. You couldn't use a computer if you weren't clicking on links. You couldn't open anything. So it's actually really counterintuitive to say to people, because it's really hard for them to determine then, what does that mean for me? How do I enact that? Because I have to, right? I have to do these things. And then to also get rid of certain wording like easy and simple, again, because I don't believe that you can determine someone else's ability for ease or simple, to predetermine that for them. Taking away subtle things like that, allowing people to see the words differently and engage using that, like I said, that more positive framing is definitely a way forward. And on a more fundamental level. And of course, then around this space, there's a lot more innovation around actually companies looking at the research that is out there. Like I said, I've taken part in for 10 years, that have started to build that into tooling to look at the idea of human risk as a concept, and how do we then marry up understanding people's attitudes, perceptions, motivations against then the technology that we already have that will tell us from the behavioral analytics of what people are doing, what we're seeing they are actually doing, and then actually marrying those two things together to give us a proper idea of what human risk is really there, to show hotspots. Now that space is still relatively new and yet to be completely proven, but it's definitely a direction, especially in a large organization where you can't do more of the academic work of going out and interviewing people and finding out on the ground, because scale, like lots of people, that's really difficult. So this sort of tooling and that sort of direction will hopefully inform that a bit better. So I definitely see that as something coming forward.
Can I refer back to something Ceri said at the beginning of that answer that struck me? There's a lot of interesting work going on around new security awareness techniques, but not many people know about them. Yeah. And that led me to a question that I was going to ask anyway, given your government background. What is the role of government? Classically, one role of government is to be a kind of system integrator, so it can pull together different sets of activities and present them in a common format. Mm-hmm. Could that be a solution to this problem, that lots of work's going on, but it's not accessible to most people?
Yeah, and it's something that, like I said, in the NCSC, if you go to the website and look up like people-centered security or passwords or things like that, you will find a lot of that pull through into blogs, into guidance in the way that things are written. But I still think that a lot of people don't realize that information is free to take, free to use, that it's still there, that you can, this stuff, even though, don't get me wrong, it's a couple of years old now, but still very, very relevant and something to learn from. I do think that the NCSE, which is quite surprising having left, I've become a bigger advocate for the NCSE's work, because I've realized actually there's still a large amount of people that don't realize that what's there, that how to use it either, and who the NCSE are. And I do think there is a bigger role to how to transition that. I'm where that gap is, I'm not entirely sure, but I do think there is definitely more there, because there is content, there is help, but it's not always being utilized in the way that I think the NCSE expects.
No, I totally agree with all of that. I'm an assiduous follower on LinkedIn of all of the NCSE announcements and so on. In fact, they'll be announcing their new mandate in November, and I think that's going to be something to watch to see how they see their future role. Very, very important potentially in this space. But as you say, not much known and not much used, unfortunately.
Yeah, and again, it might be that the NCSE work, again, because I've been close to it and helped write some of it, it might be that it's still it's still not fit for purpose in a way, but that needs to be told what's missing, because that work can evolve, because there's ongoing research. It's not like the research has stopped. There's ongoing learning that is happening, and how that is pulled through to influence and then engage people is always a learning point for them. So it is always of interest.
Ceri, thank you very much. I'm going to have to bring it to a close, I'm afraid. We're very close to 2 o'clock. Thank you, Ceri. Fantastic, as always. Richard, thank you for your contribution, as always. I would like just to say we have a couple of webinars coming up, our future webinars. We have one on the 16th of November with a lady called Ellie Warner, who leads the Global Cyber Training and Awareness Program at Standard Chartered Bank, and she's going to be talking about the role of diversity and cognitive diversity in particular in influencing security behaviour change. And then we're finalising a date, but with Professor Phil Morgan at Cardiff University, who I know Ceri knows very well. He's doing some fantastic work, particularly around applied research. He is an academic, but he's embedded within Airbus, and some of the work there is beginning to sort of give us some of the answers to some of the questions that we've raised this morning. So that's likely, I suspect, to be in January rather than December. But hope you can all make the event in November with Ellie talking about cognitive diversity. And in the meantime, we would love to get your feedback on these events. Please, if you do get an opportunity, please email me or Richard, or just put something in the chat to say whether you enjoyed it. Give us the good, bad, and the ugly about the event, because as we've been saying, it's important that we always learn and develop and evolve and adapt based on what our audience wants. So thank you everyone for attending. We look forward to seeing you again. We have a recording. We'll be sending out a recording of the webinar very shortly to you in the next few days. And we also produce a summary document of the discussions, and that will take a little bit longer to produce, but that should be around to all of you within the next 2 to 3 weeks. So thanks again, everyone. And finally, thanks again, Ceri and Richard. Very good, really enjoyable session. And we look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks very much.